What I'm going to do for this just quick, relatively quick 101, probably about 45 minutes or so. And I'll take questions too, so please feel free to interrupt me as we go through this. I'm going to talk about what it is. I'll talk in that a little bit about the history of it since it was asked. I'll talk about does it mean that it's open source, and I'll talk about what open source software is a bit and why that's important. And I'll just quickly go through the components of OpenOffice and talk a bit about its strengths and weaknesses, talk a little bit about how to migrate or whether to migrate, and then about integration with other Office suites like Google Apps, Microsoft Office, et cetera. And I'll answer questions as well. So what is OpenOffice.org? And also just a little note, it is actually called OpenOffice.org. It is actually not accurate to call it OpenOffice, even though we do all the time, because somebody else owns a trademark for that phrase. So just, I try to remember to call it OpenOffice.org, but anyway. So it is a cross-platform, multifunction Office suite. And so it runs on any platform, well, any of the three major platforms, Windows, Macintosh, and Linux. It has, I'll talk about all the components, but it's got, the kitchen sink in terms of an Office suite. It supports open standards. So all of the document formats, except for OpenOffice Base, which is a separate issue, but all of the formats, the word processing, the spreadsheet, the presentation are all open document format, which is a standard that was approved several years ago, which I'll talk a little bit about open standards, but basically it means that because it's public, an open standard is a standard that's published and it's free. And so that means that anybody in perpetuity can implement software that uses an open standard. So that's really important. It does read and write Microsoft Office formats except for the newest format, which is DocX for Microsoft 2007, I think. I tell, interestingly enough, that Office 2007, the new service pack or something, now or will actually read open document format, which I find fascinating. And at some point, I'm sure that OpenOffice.org will also read the DocX format. It's matured considerably. I've been using it forever, since the way beginning. And so it's always gratifying. Every new release, I'm like, wow, this is, it really has matured. If anybody ever used it at 1.0, how many of you ever used it at 1.0? No? Okay. So, yeah, okay. It's just incredible how much it's changed. It's really great. It's free as in beer. That means you can download it and use it at no cost. And it is also free software. That is, it's open source. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So as I said, it's cross-platform. It's available as a free download for Windows. It's bundled with most Linux distributions. So when you put in Ubuntu or Red Hat or Fedora or whatever, it actually comes with. And there are 2 versions available for the Macintosh. This is actually where the Macintosh is you're a little bit at a disadvantage, unfortunately. The official OpenOffice.org for the Mac only works with X Windows. Those of you who have Macs, maybe you know about X Windows. It's actually a separate windowing environment that doesn't use the native, nice, cool, groovy Apple graphics. So it's a little rougher. It's not quite as nice. There's a program called Neo Office, which is it's a port of OpenOffice. It's done by an independent group. It's pretty good, although it lags behind in terms of the features. So it's working on a code base that's older than the official newest version. There is going to be an Aqua port for OpenOffice, Aqua being, to have all the nice, cool, and groovy interface stuff. But it's in alpha, so it's way behind. So the Mac is actually sort of the poorer cousin in the OpenOffice realm, which is really quite unfortunate to my mind. But actually, if you don't mind running X Windows, the newest version for the Mac is always up, is always available to you. So it's open source. What does that mean, that it's open source? Why is that a good thing? So let me just tell you a little bit about what open source software is, for those of you who don't know. Open source software, it's been around for a while now, and it's gaining currency. And how many of you use Firefox? Okay, so Firefox is the poster child, the open source poster child, because many people, like my parents, for instance, use Firefox and have no idea that it's open source, which is great. I mean, I think that's really wonderful. So what open source software is basically it's software that is generally freely available to download and use. You can download it and use it for free. You can install it wherever, as many copies as you want. There's no license fees. It's generally based on open standards. So again, open standards are standards that are published and that are freely accessible, which means that anybody can know how a certain format is put together, and anybody can recreate that format in a totally and completely, a way that's totally and completely consistent. So what we'll talk about in a little bit is the issue of interoperability between OpenOffice and Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word's format, except the recent one, and that's sort of a long story. But I won't, if we want to talk about that, we'll talk about it, but it's sort of a long story. But historically, Microsoft Office's formats were not open standards. And so what that meant was that nobody knew how documents were put together, and people who wanted to be able to read Microsoft Office formats had to reverse engineer them, which, as you might imagine, is problematic, because if you can't know in detail how a document is put together, you can try to reverse engineer it, but you're going to be wrong. I mean, there's no question you're going to be wrong. And so it is true. I mean, OpenOffice has gotten much better over the years, but I remember a long time ago, this is back probably 2002, 2003, I had a colleague of mine who used to like to use Word to he would just do all this crazy formatting stuff. And so I'd be submitting bugs to the OpenOffice team using my colleagues' documents, because they were completely, totally messed up. So, and it's gotten much, much better, but there still are fidelity issues. It's not completely perfect. But an open standard, it would be perfect, because the standard is open. Everybody knows exactly how a document is put together, and that is freely accessible on the web. It's published. So any software developer who wants to implement an open standard can do it, and their software will render the document in a totally, completely consistent way based upon the person who made the document. Why this is important for you, for anybody, it's important for anybody in terms of long-term storage of documents, in terms of, how many of you have floppy disks, or maybe you actually managed to save it on a hard drive, documents that were written in a word processor that no longer exists? I mean, right? It happens. And so, and that's lost unless somebody has done the work to do that, to sort of do that reverse engineering and get that data out of that old document, out of those old formats. But an open standard is one that it's published. So it is always possible for you to render documents in their original form, theoretically 100 years later. You can still because those formats are open. So that's really what's important. That's why it's important. And so OpenOffice is based on open standards. It's just, anyway. So that's, for me, I think, I was an academic, so I actually have a fairly reasonable sort of idea about sort of what's important in terms of sort of keeping documents over the long term, and what's important in terms of data access and information access. And if there's one good argument, or one of the major good arguments for libraries for OpenOffice, it's going to be the open standards argument. So the code is available. So you can go to openoffice.org or any website for any open source project, Firefox, for instance, and download the source code. And for most people, that's not going to do you any good, because maybe you're not a programmer, or you wouldn't know how to read it, or whatever. But the reason why that's important is that means, back to the question that somebody, I think maybe you asked, that software never has to die. Okay, so if you've got a company that's written a software product and it's really popular, and then for some reason the company goes out of business or decides to stop supporting that software or whatever, you're stuck. There's nothing you can do. You're totally you're out of luck, and it's happened many, many times. But with open source software, the code is always available. So if somebody has the code, that software can live on if somebody cares enough about it and wants it to live on. And that's really important. And also it means that if, this has also happened, a great example, there's this great software that I've used a lot called Active Collab, which was a project management software that was an open source tool. And the person who wrote Active Collab, which is his right, decided to take it closed source. He decided to make it a commercial product. It's his total right. He made it. He could do it. But the people but what people did was they took the last version of that code that was open source and forked it into something called Project Peer. So now there is an open source project management package. It's a Basecamp clone, if anybody's used Basecamp. It's actually quite good, and it's going in a great direction, and it's been saved from being closed forever, because you can do that with open source software. So that's sort of why it's really important to have the code available. It's community-driven and community-owned. Because it's out there, because you can find the code, the community, in a sense, owns it. It's owned by the community. The copyright is the person who made it, but in terms of thinking about sort of like who can have access to it, who can modify it, who can have input in it, it's really sort of a community process. And that's really great. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I've always been wondering how, if there's like, say someone takes some software and builds a great case management solution, how does that then go back to, how do they modify the code base, or how is that available if I come along and looking for a case management solution?
Right.
How might that play out? I know it's very strong.
It varies, but I mean, the basic models there's sort of two basic models for how open source software starts. And one of them is that some developer or a small group of developers has a very particular need, or they say itch to scratch, and they write the software. And the second model is that actually a company writes the software. But who gets involved after that depends upon who's interested. And in some situations, the community around it is actually pretty small and stays just those people who are really interested. It could be sort of mostly around the company that made it. There's a great example, there's a package called Sugar CRM, which is an open source package, but yet it was built by a company, and it's kept alive by the company. It does have a community of users and some developers around it, but the company is the primary driver. Whereas actually, Civa CRM, which is another example, is a nonprofit-focused CRM. It has a larger community of folks around it. There's a small development group, but that's growing, and it is actually, in a sense, driven by people who are users in the user community.
So I was actually thinking of that example. Now, I heard there's a case management.
There is. We should I'll have a talk with you about that at the break, because it's a great example, great story, and it's sort of off the topic, but yeah. But yeah, so in a sense, because everybody can have access to the code, people can take it in any direction they want. In general, the open source, the communities around a software package determine the direction it goes in. I have a great example. I'm involved. I'm a documentation manager of a project called Open MRS, which is a medical record system which is designed mostly for HIV/AIDS clinics in Africa. But there's a community of doctors and users of this, and these are the things they need. They get involved in the community, and they say, we really need X to happen. We really need a new reporting module, whatever. And then that sort of gets fed in, and the developers can sort of work on it depending upon the needs of the people around it. So, and again, it's available to all. And for me, this is sort of one of the most important parts about open source software. It's sort of the reason why I got involved in it. Is that basically this provides that anybody, no matter what their financial resources, can have access to quality software. And that's, for me, one of the really important parts about open source software. So any questions about open source software before I move back to OpenOffice? You feel like you got a good feeling for it and understanding for what open source software is and that sort of stuff? It's also often called free software, which, it's funny because in the nonprofit world, when I use free software, people just think it doesn't cost anything. And they don't really understand that free software actually has to do with the information part of that it is free, it is open. And some people call it free and open source software. But anyway, you can choose your term. Oh, no, see, I already did this. I forgot that was here. There we go. Okay, so openoffice.org. So let me just sort of go through the components for you pretty quickly. It's got a word processor. Just look at the time here. And it's called Writer. It's got a spreadsheet. It's called Calc. It's got a presentation program that I'm using right now that's called Impress. It has a database system, which I'll show you. It's got a drawing program. It's got an HTML editor. If you're a mathematician, it's got a formula editor. It's a pretty well-rounded. It's got the basics of any Office suite and more. They all work together in the same way as all Office suites do. They have very similar interfaces. The menus are in the same places. The little toolboxes are in the same places. The configuration is pretty much the same. So once you know one of them, it's pretty much easy to know them all. They're totally full functioning. And at this point, it's pretty bug-free. That was not true 3 or 4 years ago. It is true now. The word processor, there's lots of inputs and output filters. So, anything from WordPerfect, all the Word versions, a bunch of different other types of formats, rich text format and others. And one of the great things about Writer, One of the great things about Writer is that it exports directly to PDF, which means that although these days there's a lot of new or free PDF writers, but for a while it was the only choice you had, except for paying for Adobe Acrobat. So, and you can do columns and tables and all the basic stuff that you can do I've been using OpenOffice Writer exclusively for I don't even know, since 2002, 2003. I mean, that's all I've ever used. Since then. And calc, spreadsheet. Basic stuff, lots of formulas and functions. It has graphs, again, lots of input and output filters, integrates with everything. It's a basic spreadsheet program. And Impress, again, just like PowerPoint in terms of what it's got. Basically the features of these three, of Writer, Calc, and Impress, are 90% of the features of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. So for 95%, I was just there showing the animation. For 95% of the people, it's going to be fine. Reads and writes PowerPoint files, has templates, master pages, does animation. I already said that. Okay, so OpenOffice Base, and I will demo OpenOffice Base during the lunch break. But it's designed as an Access clone. You can see from the interface, you'll see it, that it looks just like Access, the whole interface thing. It uses this thing called HSQLDB, which is a backend that's, if you know Access, it's sort of the equivalent of JET, but it is open source. It's in Java, and it's free and open source. So the database backend is free and open source, and the front end is open source. You can also use any other databases like MySQL or PostgreSQL or Oracle or MS SQL Server or whatever using ODBC. And it can actually read Access files, but only the table structure and the data. It can't import forms or reports or queries or anything like that. And it is not equivalent to the present Access. So if you've ever used Access, if you use Access, you remember what Access 97 was like? That's kind of about what this is like. Okay, so it's not there. But it's actually improved amazingly. This is a drawing program. I like it. It's fun. It's very useful for drawing diagrams and flowcharts, and it's great. And it's really easy to insert the drawings that you make into your documents or your spreadsheets or whatever. If you need math, there's math. Almost nobody I ever talk to ever needs it, but I think it's cool. And you can actually sort of get an idea of the audience that OpenOffice is geared toward, the fact that there's an equation editor. It actually is pretty much geared toward an academic audience. Academic librarians, take note. And there's an HTML editor. It's very basic. It's a WYSIWYG, but it's very basic. But it will actually, if you want to do simple HTML documents, you can do that. And you also can convert, your documents into HTML pretty easily. So the strengths of OpenOffice.org. And by the way, just so you know, the OOO, that's the sort of abbreviation that I'll be using throughout. It's sort of easy. It's open source. It's free as in beer. It depends on our standards. We've talked about all that stuff. It reads and writes MS Office formats. Google Docs does read these files and also exports to these files. So that's great. And in fact, I I have to say that I guess about 2 years ago, I stopped saving any of my documents in .doc format, because you can set up OpenOffice to default save in .doc format if you do a lot of sharing with other people. And I sort of just stopped doing that, and I send people either PowerPoint or Open Document format. And if they can't open the Open Document format, I tell them to just upload it to Google. so I don't, because I just hate the idea of sending around documents that are not an open format. It's my personal political statement. And as I said, it has about 90% of the functionality of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. So almost everybody will be completely happy. I mean, there are some people I know who just really, somebody had a question about macros. You had a question about macros? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I mean, and I actually know very little bit about OpenOffice.org macros, because most people use these applications in a fairly generic vanilla way. So for most people, OpenOffice will be perfectly fine. And I've written a book on OpenOffice. I've written primers. I've written all my articles. Everything I write, I use OpenOffice for, and it's been fine. So the components are integrated. There are lots of developers. I don't know how many, but there are a ton. It is backed by some very big corporations, by Sun, IBM, and Novell, and others. So there are people who work full-time for Sun or Novell or IBM, and they work full-time on OpenOffice. So there's got a lot of industry backing, which is actually, it's sort of an interesting evolutionary thing with open source software. For a long time, it was just, sort of enthusiasts and, volunteers and, academic coders, and but in the last few years, it's really grown to be a business. And I don't know how many of you heard about, there's a program, a database called MySQL, which is the back end of just about every website on the planet. And it was bought, the company that is behind MySQL was bought by Sun for $1 billion. Okay, so MySQL is free and open source software. You can download it, you can use it for free, you can look at the source code, the whole thing. But the company that sort of supports it and is responsible for it was sold for $1 billion. So it's a big business now. So, and I think that's, it's funny. It's like, I think some people think that's a bad thing, but I actually think that's a good thing. It's funny, I have this, the metaphor that people used with trickle-down economics was that it was a tide that lifted all boats, which was like a lie. Well, I think open source software is actually, the money that goes into it is actually truly a tide that lifts all boats. I actually really believe that. So I think it's fine that there are big companies involved. And there are lots of third-party extensions. So there's actually a site that has all the extensions. So there's tons of different things people have been using and ways people have been extending OpenOffice. So that's really cool. So weaknesses. There's still a few kinks. It's not perfect. Base, for really simple databases, it's actually pretty good. But in general, it kind of sucks. Okay, I'll just say that.
Well, Access kind of sucks.
Well, that's true. Access does kind of, yeah. I know, it's true. Access does kind of suck, but yeah. But they wanted to copy Access, so. Again, it can't read Office Open XML, which is the Microsoft Office new XML version, which, can't read that yet. I'm sure it will soon. It's still true, unfortunately, that it's not 100% perfect that Microsoft Office documents are rendered perfectly in OpenOffice. So I often do webinars, and so I write my presentations, my webinars in OpenOffice, but I have to export them to PowerPoint because the webinar software only takes PowerPoint. And things are moved a little bit, different character weirdnesses. It's never perfect. The menus and features are different than Microsoft Office. It just is true. They're in different places, is what I mean. So, and they're sometimes called different things. So it's not, so that you have to get used to a slightly different interface. Although I'll tell you a story about that, which is that I have had various friends of mine who are very low tech. Really, really low tech. And they couldn't afford to or didn't want to pay for Microsoft Office. So I installed OpenOffice for them, and I haven't heard a word, and they just use it. So I think it's not, I mean, I haven't heard a complaint. I haven't heard, and I have friends of mine who write a lot and write books and do presentations and stuff, and I really haven't heard a word. So I think that's a good sign, These weren't geeks I was giving it to. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand, so if I were a student using OpenOffice,
Uh-huh.
I would paper, save it as a doc, and send it to my professor to read.
Uh-huh.
And the professor opened it, would the formatting be all weird?
Well, if it was just a paper with a footer and page numbers and basic, it's fine. I mean, I've done that plenty of times. It's fine. It's weird stuff. I mean, it's stuff like, presentations are a little bit, because the graphics might be slightly off, or there might be a special character that I use that doesn't translate. But it's pretty much, it looks fine. I mean, it's not like it looks horrible. It looks fine. And papers, if students do that at papers, it's fine. I mean, nobody will notice.
Is it just like a preview mode, or can one see it somewhere, like one of the professors?
No, I mean, the only way you'd be able to do it is to open it up in Word and look. What I do if I really, really, really want to make sure that the formatting is perfect is I export it to PDF and send the PDF. And that's, it's going to be perfect. So. Okay, so if you're doing collaborative editing, like if you've got a group of people, some of you use OpenOffice, some of you use Word, forget it. Don't even bother. Use Google Apps or use some other online collaboration suite, or have everybody use one package, because it's a mess. If you go back and forth too much, especially if you're doing things like track changes and accept changes, it's really hard, and it just gets really messy. So, and that actually has gotten better. A few years ago it was impossible, and now it's messy. But it's just not, I would not suggest it. So that's not quite, and that may always be true, because again, because the doc format is not an open standard, it has to be reverse engineered, and so it always will not be perfect. And so until both sides of the fence are totally, truly open standards, you're not going to be able to collaboratively edit between different packages no matter what, in a sort of deep way. So it's not as slick. I mean, doesn't have Clippy, although I think they got rid of Clippy, didn't they? I heard they got rid of Clippy. There's some other little thing now. But anyway, it's not as slick. It doesn't have the little bells and whistles and stuff. So that's, it can be slower and take more resources, but that's actually really improved dramatically. So, I mean, I'm running 2.4 on one of my machines, and I was like, wow, it was like fast. It was like, it just came up really fast. So I think that's changing also. We talked about that. Does anybody want to hear about the Office Open XML open standard issue? Do people care? No? Nobody cares? Okay. I won't talk about it. If you have any questions.
Tell us what you're talking about, or what you mean.
Well, all right. I'll talk about it. Okay. So as I said, the Microsoft Office, the new format is called Office Open XML, which is completely confusing to everybody. But Open Document Format, which is the format that OpenOffice uses, has been a standard for quite some time. It's 2006. Okay. OpenOffice XML, which is Microsoft Office's standard, was submitted to standards boards and it's like it's like this thick, and it's completely Byzantine. It was, in fact, approved, surprisingly enough to me, but how easy it is to implement that open standard is kind of contested, because it's so Byzantine. But so when I did a talk on OpenOffice a while ago, Office Open XML was not a standard. And so there was sort of more contrast. But now that it is a standard, they actually are now both theoretically based on open standards. So that's just the whole thing. But people, the Microsoft standard is problematic in a number of ways. Okay, so let me talk about how to get help, because we're going to be using that a lot today. And actually, I did this faster than I thought. And actually, all of the links for these help things are on the wiki under share a link, I think. So the thing about getting help with an open source software package is that, and this is sort of changing, I think, quite rapidly, but for a long time, self-help was your only option. self-help being, and self-help actually can be really great. I mean, the community help that is around a lot of open source packages is astoundingly good. But it doesn't, people are often used to calling somebody up, or they're used to going to trainings where they sit and people tell them what to do. Or they're used to, they're used to getting sort of more facilitated official help. And for open source software, that's not been available really for a long time. That is changing. There are now more companies that support open source software. There are more trainings available for various open source packages. So that is slowly changing. But in terms of, for the most part, since there aren't a huge number of people who use OpenOffice yet, it's still going to be a lot of self-help. But the help is great. There are forums on openoffice.org, the official forums, where you can, they're divided up by components, and you can ask anything from an incredibly newbie question to an incredible detailed question about, I tried to do this macro and it didn't work, why? I mean, everything, the whole gamut, or even there are people who are developers in there who are saying, I tweaked this code, So the whole range. There's a range of, some open source communities are less friendly toward newbies, and others are more friendly, and it sort of ranges depending upon the package. But the OpenOffice folks are very friendly toward newbies, so don't worry about asking totally beginner questions. And it's very active, lots of people answering questions. There is an IRC channel. How many of you know about IRC? A few of you. IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat, which is an online live chat system. And you can find, if you're on Windows, what is the name of that program? That really popular instant messenger program? Starts with a T? Trillian. Yeah, Trillian also does IRC. But there are just if you Google IRC client, you'll find a ton of them. My favorite is called XChat. But you basically put in the server and you put in the channel, and there'll be a bunch of people sitting there, and you can just ask a question real time. Say, how do I do this? And people will answer. So, and I'll demo that later at lunch. And then there's a bunch of links that I put in to sort of help you out. And I think we have a straggler who has arrived. So that's it for the basic 101. And actually, we have more time than I thought, which is great. Are there questions about that? Yeah.
This might be a bit naive, but
It's okay.
there's a lot of money going into this stuff to develop it.
Mm-hmm.
How is anyone making a profit on it if it's free?
That's a good question. There are a number of ways people make money on open source software, and I don't know that I can answer that with OpenOffice in particular. But most people who are putting money into open source software are also providing services to companies and organizations and people. And it's those services that people pay for. So it could be consulting about how to migrate. I mean, if you've got a huge company and they want to, implement this one package throughout the company, it's a huge job. And so there's a lot of time and effort and energy. And so that sort of stuff people make money on. In some examples, like the Sugar CRM example I mentioned, there's a community edition of Sugar CRM, and then there are other editions that you pay for. And what you pay for are sometimes added features, or you pay for support, somebody to call, that kind of thing. That's a major model. For OpenOffice.org, I don't know exactly what. I mean, Novell has their own version of Linux, and so OpenOffice is part of that suite, and people pay for that. It's SUSE Linux, and people pay for a version of SUSE Linux which has support and features, has extra stuff. So that might be part of it too. But primarily, people have been making money on services. Yeah.
Add into that, some of what is going on is a sort of growth and like a gift economy. You look at the time people put into development something like Wikipedia, not getting paid for it, or all sorts of like socially produced information that's available. And I think it's just becoming more built into our entire global economy. Sort of open information, freely available information. And so I think the corporations, like everyone, can't help but get involved in it.
Yeah. Yep.
really ingrained in our economy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And there are some projects, like the one I'm working on, which nobody makes money on. I mean, it's the medical record system that I work on. You know, there's no corporate, you know, money behind it. Actually, the WHO, World Health Organization, helps to fund it. But so there are lots of examples of open source software where nobody actually makes any money off it. That this entire gift economy sort of thing.
The costs have come down so much.
Yes.
Because
Yep.
people have the
Exactly.
computing power to
Exactly.
build these things
Exactly.
collaboratively.
Yep.
So it's not
Yep.
like, you know, 20 years ago, Microsoft slaving over
Yeah.
all this. Like, oh yeah, we need 100 people to write the software. And I have people all around the world contributing, so that
Yes,
cost
and
of developing has gone down dramatically.
yeah, totally. There's a great site which people may or may not know about. It's called olo.net, and it is a site which talks about open source projects, and you can find out, like, let's just pick Mozilla because that's easy. So it's got information, it's got reviews, who uses it, but the great thing it's got down here is, although that's wrong, but that's okay. It sort of summarizes, that's definitely wrong, but it sort of summarizes how much the software, because Firefox would cost way more than that, but anyway, how much software would cost if somebody had to like write it from scratch, based upon the number of lines of code, which is, of course, a problematic estimate of anything. But you can sort of get a feeling for how much, you know, there's some which would, you know, would cost gazillions, you know, if it were written from scratch. So, but it's a great, those are where all the developers are for Firefox. Let me actually look up OpenOffice. And you can also learn about the code and how it's licensed, what it's written in. It's written mostly in C and C++. It's got a very large active development team. It's got a mature, well-established code base. And it would cost, yeah, this one is a little, it would cost $138 million to write from scratch. $138 million was not spent in writing this. So, just so that you sort of have a feeling for that. But it's a great site. Okay, so given that introduction, do people have some, we had a newcomer. So can you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Glenn Angstead. I work for the County of Chester in Westchester, Pennsylvania.
Cool. Thank you for coming so far away. I think you actually came further than me. I came from Western Massachusetts, so I don't know whether that's further, but Pennsylvania sounds further away. So, any changes or additions to this breakout session brainstorm that people want to add or subtract, or based upon what I just talked about? So, let's see. Should we, I don't have any little stickies, but why don't I just do a round of, let me just take hands for each of these, and then we'll pick the top, say 6 or something, or 8, and do those. So, and actually, do people think that the policy questions and the issues with OpenOffice.org were sort of the same? Hi, you are? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, come on in, have a seat. Yeah.
I can't believe you went from that. So.
Okay, that's fine. Do people think that the issues with OpenOffice.org and policy questions are sort of the same? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is what Steve was mentioning before, but there's issues with OpenOffice sort of dealing with skepticism amongst peers and institutions. Is that?
I think, yeah. I think that was, yeah.
I think that those would be related.
Yeah, so I'll say policy questions / issues. Oops. Okay, so policy questions and issues. Raise your hand if you want to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Unique features of OpenOffice.org. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Just to be clear, people are saying things that they'd be interested in going to, but not saying like committing to.
Right, no commitments, I'm sorry, thank you. No commitments, just what you're interested in, and you can vote for as many of these as you want. So don't feel like you have to, the choice will be in the sort of the highest numbers.
Can I just ask I don't know, what are we voting on?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, you sort of missed the beginning. So these are there are 2 breakout sessions. Just groups get together and talk about and investigate stuff.
Two sectors.
There's one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And so these, we're brainstorming ideas for what these breakout groups would talk about. And and now we're voting so that we can isolate this down to the top 6. So people can, so we'll have 3 or 4. Maybe we'll do it.
Determining what the subject of the actual breakout is.
Yes, yes.
How many sessions? Are these separate groups then?
Right, we'll be breaking up into small groups.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there'll be 6 groups maybe?
Yeah, I think 6. Let's see. Let me just count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. I think we probably should do 4 groups each session. So we'll do 8 groups. Okay? Okay, so Google integration and other web services integration.